Hello, I'm Janelle Pirtle, and I'm representing the Larimer County Foster Parent Consortium, Training Consortium. And tonight's presentation is by Paul Holdeman, and he is well known in the Loveland and Fort Collins community. And I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself because it's an interesting story. But tonight's topic is about motivation, and I thought of Paul because every time I've heard him speak, I've always felt reaffirmed in what I believe to be true about kids and what they need from us as adults.
I'm Paul Holdeman. I've lived in this community since 1959, and I have worked all over Larimer, and for 12 years, that included Jackson counties. I was chief of probation for 12 years, and during that time I always carried a juvenile caseload myself, so I've worked with juvenile delinquents as well as adult criminals. I also have worked when I first came to Loveland, I was youth director at the Methodist Church, and had a very interesting time developing a youth program there. And then I was appointed the first school social worker they had in this district. In fact, nobody knew what I was supposed to do, so I had to write my own job description. And then I was appointed chief of probation, and I was there for 12 years. And then I started a company called helped with a friend of mine. We started a company called Center for Life Skills Education, and we taught classes mainly for drinking driving offenders. After I left the court system, they asked me if I would teach classes to drinking driving offenders, and I did that for 6 years. And then I was asked to help out with a couple churches, two churches that merged over in Greeley, and then I was there for a year, and then I went as a guest. I thought I was going as a guest speaker to Unity of Fort Collins for 2 Sundays, and after the second Sunday they asked me if I would speak every Sunday for the next 9 months until a ministerial class graduated, and at the end of that time they asked me if I would up for another year, and I said no. I says, let's just do it on a 30-day basis, and so I've been there for 13 and a half years as a guest speaker, and just resigned last Sunday, so I'm footloose right now. Well, the topic this evening is how you define it is how you behave towards it. I want to show you how important it is to think of how we define something. For example, supposing I hold up this pen and I ask you, define this pen for me. What would you say? I did it for myself right now, but you would call it a what? A pen. So if you called it a pen, what would you do with it? Now, supposing I did this. Now what is it? A weapon, and your response to it becomes profoundly different, right? So, people don't think about this. I remember several years ago, I was talking to a very, very bright boy who was a senior at Loveland High School, but he was failing. He was failing in every subject, and we all knew that he was a very bright boy. So I was trying to understand how he was looking at things and trying to understand. So I said, okay. I said, let me give you some words and you give me the first thing that comes to your mind. So I said, Dad. He said, and I said, Mom. He said, bitch. And I said, school. He said, bummer. And then I said, party. And he said, I think I said fun. And then he said, party. Then I said, party. And he said, drunk. And I said, oh, in other words, to have fun at a party, you got to get drunk. Is that it? And he thought a little bit, and he said, yeah. I said, now just stop and think about this. You've defined your mother as bitch, right? So when you go home and she's trying to reach out to you and she says, "Did you have a good day, son?" I remember how he's defined her. What is he thinking? None of your business. What you prying around for? Because I said, under those circumstances, she can't win, can she? Because he's already defined her as somebody he doesn't want to talk to. Now, I call this creating the context of your life. So I'd like for you to help me out a little bit here. And what would you, how would you define a parent? Now, I'm not talking just foster parent. I would say, how would you define a parent? Okay, caregivers. Just anything. What was that? Guardian. Nurture. What is it? Educator. You guys can help too. Rule setter. Disciplinarian. You're challenging my spelling here.
Example.
Okay, now, if you define, and you're all parents, right? So if you define yourself as, now I'm including whether you're natural parents or foster parents, doesn't make any difference. If you're defining yourself at this, it looks to me like, given all of this, that you're going to be successful with every kid you have, right? And she said wrong. So what else happens here? Besides being all of these things, what might a parent be? Human. I guess I'll write this over here, human. Now you see, now here's another interesting thing. If you're going to define human, human means what? If a human does what?
They fail.
Humans, now you remember you're defining human now, right? Humans fail. What else do we mean by human? Needs? They have needs. Say it again. I didn't get it yet. Limits. Ah, yeah, limits. In other words, we're not always all powerful. So there's limits to that. It's interesting to me that we always use human to define limitations. What if human meant you are, let me describe a perfect human being. This is a description of a perfect human being. It's also a description of a perfect husband. It happens to be also a description of a perfect wife. And it also happens to be a description of a perfect kid. He's full of love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and in control of self. How's that sound? If you were thinking about your spouse as being someone who had all of those qualities, how would that seem to you? Too good to be true. Create some doubts because we're so invested in the fact that humans aren't that way. Now, let me suggest another thing. Supposing I could say, is this your husband? Supposing I could say, this is an accurate description of who he is when he's being who he is. But you see, we don't know who we are all the time, and so sometimes we act out who we're not. True? By the way, I've noticed that I've been doing this for many years, and I've noticed that I have yet to find the person who doesn't think that if that were true, this what I just described, love and joy and peace and patience, that everybody from every walk of life says, well, yeah. In fact, when I'm dealing with divorce situations, I said, supposing I could describe your husband or your wife as being full of love and joy and peace, would you want to live with him? And they always say, well, yeah, if it would be like that. But you see, we've defined human, or we've defined parents to be less than that, haven't we? And we've defined kids. Now, if I'm going to erase this and we started defining kids, how would we define kids? Would we describe kids this way or this way? See, in our culture, we have been taught, our culture generally speaks, and this was so profoundly true of my childhood, leave the kid alone and he will do wrong. Therefore, the parent has to play the role of disciplinarian, because otherwise what will happen?
They won't have any limits.
Now, supposing, see, people, I worked in probation for all those years, and I used to say to the police officers, I remember one sergeant said to me, he says, Holdeman, you think you're going to win on all of them, don't you? And I said, yeah. And he looked at me with skepticism, and he said, well, that's not very realistic, is it? And I said, well, I don't know if it's realistic, but what's the alternative? Should I be planning on losing? I said, what if I'm working with your son? Do you want me to be planning on losing? Well, no. I said, well, look, if I see a perfect child, if I see a child that I'm working with, now remember, he's a juvenile delinquent, but if I see buried in there a perfect child, I asked him this. I said, how will I treat him if I know that buried in all of this stuff here, there's a perfect kid there? How will I treat him? He said, well, I guess with respect. And I said, and if I treat him with respect, how will he respond? And he says, well, I guess with respect. I said, if respect does it, why are we so committed to punishment? I said, look, every kid I work with has a perfect kid buried in there. By perfect, I mean he's full of love and joy and peace and patience. But how many of us know that that's true down deep inside? Now, the title of this first part of this talk is how you define it is how you behave towards it. If we define kids, if kids define their parents as flawed, if that's our fundamental definition of them, then how are we going to treat each other? I'll have to tell you my most dramatic story right up front here. Janelle, I suppose you might remember this one. I was asked to see a 14-year-old girl several years ago. She was 14 years old, 7 months pregnant. And I'm going to tell you, I've worked with a lot of juvenile delinquents, but this girl was absolutely the snottiest, profane, obscene kid I worked with in 20 years, bar none. She could have me yelling at her within 2 minutes flat when I'd go to visit her at her house. And I struggled. She missed about 75% of her appointments, and so I'd end up talking to her mother. So finally one day, while I was extremely exasperated at her because I was having a hard time seeing love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and being in control of self. In fact, the story is that she had her baby, and within 3 months, social services had to remove her for neglect. But to get her baby back, she had to continue to go to counseling, so she kept coming, or she didn't keep coming, but I kept going to see her. And finally, one day I said to her, and I'm going to give her a name, I guess I'll call her, I'll give her my wife's name. How's that? Helen will really like this. I'll call her Helen. I said, Helen, I said, no more. And she said, no more what? I said, I refuse to believe that your behavior tells me who you are. I said, there's a perfect girl buried in there somewhere. And I said, from now on, I only speak to that perfect girl. And she said, perfect like hell. I said, well, you don't have to agree with me. That's my choice. I choose to see a perfect girl. Well, I didn't know it, but she had helped a boyfriend write some bad checks, and she got picked up. She was already on probation for something else, and she got picked up and sent to the detention center. At that time, we used to take them all to Brighton. And she was there for about 45 days, and when she came back, she called me up, and she said, would you see me one more time? And I said, yes. And when we got together, her very first words were, did you say there's a perfect girl in here somewhere? And I said, yes. She says, I've decided to let her out. There's no way for me to describe the absolute contrast in her behavior from that time on. She never missed another appointment. I never complained about her language. She never used profanities or obscenities anymore. She was full of questions. She'd say, Mr. Holdeman, why do I fight with my mother the way I do? Or one time she said, why do I drive all my boyfriends away? And I remember on one occasion she said, you know, Mr. Holdeman, I've had 3 jobs, and I've quit all of them, and they liked me. And I ran out on them. Now, it's interesting to me that the probation department did not see these changes. As far as from the testimony I heard in court later on, there's apparently this was her behavior to me, and so I don't know how to evaluate this other than the fact that I decided that it was up to me to see past the behavior to the heart of the situation. Now, supposing, whether we're looking at each other as husband and wife, or whether we're looking at our as parent and child, what if we decided that despite the fact that we don't behave that way all, still buried there is a perfect kid? Is that possible? You see, I felt like it when we were dealing with kids on probation. I still had to deal with the behavior. But it made a big difference, to me at least, in recognizing that their behavior reflected what they didn't know about themselves rather than who they were. How you define it is how you behave towards it. I like to give you a little illustration of what I think might happen here. You see, I used to give this talk, the title, one of the things I called it was How to Make an Asset Out of Your Ignorance. I did a videotape on it one time, and I couldn't sell it because nobody wanted to admit that they had some ignorance hanging around. So, but the idea is, supposing now, all of us right here, we don't know everything there is to know about kids, right? Wouldn't you say that's true? Even though we're perfect parents, we don't know what perfect is, and therefore there's a lot we don't know about kids. There's an awful lot we don't know about ourselves. So what if we could take that, what we don't know, and turn it into an asset? What would happen? Well, let me show you, give you just a rough idea of what that might look like. Let's imagine that each memory that you have is like a marble. And you got to take your marbles wherever you go, because if you don't, what will people say? Or you've lost your marbles or something like that, right? So you got to take your marbles. Well, at your age, and my age especially, we've got so many marbles that we can't carry them all. In fact, the more we try to pick up, the more fall out. So how are we going to take our marbles with us? How would you take your marbles with you? You can put them all in your pockets. There's not enough room. You got to take them all. How are you going to do it? That's one way to do it. If you got enough room, what's another way? Or you could have somebody else carry them, or you might put them in a sack, right? Now, if you put the marbles in a sack, what shape will they take?
Probably a big bumpy ball.
Pretty much like the sack, don't you think? Suppose you put them in a square box, what will they look like? Square box. What if you put your marbles, what if you wanted your marbles to look like a three-dimensional duck? What would you do to make your marbles take the shape of a duck? Either make one or find a container shaped like a duck. Now look, folks, you don't have to put your energy into the shape. You just have to choose the container that's shaped the way you want it. Right? And the marbles will take that shape easy. Now, what is the shape we're going to take here? Let's say that we're working with kids and we want to do our best to make this the best kind of experience for both them and us. And by the way, I think it's very important that one of the things that I think the container should have is fun. You know, if it isn't fun, why would you do it, you know? So, what could the container look like? Well, supposing you decided that the container that I'm going to choose to have here is that it's going to have fun. What else is it going to have? Excitement. I was thinking of the same word. We must have been communicating there. I'm not thinking right. Excitement. What else do you want in it? Excitement might also include adventure, right? Success at school, right? How about some good old appreciation? Both ways, both towards the parent as well as the child. Does this begin to look good? How about respect? Friends, yeah. How about honesty? See, all of this can be our container. This is the container that we're going to have, and this is what happens. Well, what happens then when these things don't show up? Disappointment, unless we do what? What keeps us from experiencing disappointment? Well, one thing you can do is look past the behavior to the way you want it. That's one of the ideas that you can do. But it's also recognizing that even though we all have that perfect person inside us, we're just learning how to give expression to it, aren't we? We're just learning how to do it. I'm 76, folks, and I'm telling you, I haven't figured it all out. In fact, who said we were supposed to? In fact, I want to give you my definition of perfect. I think perfect is not meaning that we don't make mistakes. See, if you'd have asked me, we have 4 kids, and if you'd have asked me when each one of them were 12 years old, I said, what are they like? And I'd have said, they're perfect 12-year-olds. Does that mean they're not making mistakes? What does it mean?
You're happy with them.
And they're dealing with the issues that you would expect them to be dealing with at that time. It's a direction rather than a plateau, is what I'm getting at here. So I think that one of the things that I believe that when we start thinking about how our expectations of kids, if they make mistakes and we have it in their mind that they're prone to evil or prone to make mistakes, and they make a mistake, then what happens to us? We're upset with them, and we're afraid. We're not only afraid that they might be messing up, we're afraid that we've messed up. Instead of seeing each one of those things as an opportunity to gain more clarity about who we really are at the core of our being. See, most of our literature, almost all of our literature, says that there's a dark side to us and there's a light side to us. You know what? One of the things we've learned from astronauts, when they go out in space and look back at the sun, do you think they see dark and light? No, they just see less light. It's not quite as light on the dark side. We say it's night over here. But when they look at it from that perspective, it's just, there's shadows over there. But it's not, they tell us that you just completely forget about it being night and day. It's just less light. Now, supposing we were looking at the mistakes that we make, the mistakes that the kids make, and we begin to see it in the context of it's not so much a question of whether it is prone to evil, but what is, here's an experience there that might bring clarity to us as to who we truly are. One of the things that I tried to do with kids, especially the kids on probation that I worked with, and I guess, Janelle, that would be in the hundreds, wouldn't it? One of the things that I came to see was that whenever I was supposed to start working with a kid and he had committed some delinquent offense and now he's under the jurisdiction of the court, you see, the typical approach to kids like this is, okay, now you've broken the law. Now you're going to have to do, and we had 10 probation rules. That's what we had, 10 rules that they have to live up to in order to get off probation after 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever it might be. Now, how do you think a kid feels when you go to him and say, now here's 10 things you're going to have to do now for the next year? How do you think he reacts to that?
You probably don't care. Pretty down, maybe.
Do you all agree with that? Pardon? She said he rebels. What is he rebelling against?
Many rules.
And what's the flip side of rules? Now, one of the things we had up here is rule makers, or what was your word? Rule setters, yeah. So what's the flip side of rule setting?
Probably no rules, trust.
And okay, no rules would mean what? Freedom. By the way, this is one of the things I learned in my years in probation. You can take any audience, in fact, maybe I ought to do it with you right here. What reasons would we as a group of adults give for why a kid should finish high school? Okay, that's a new one on me. I've never had that one before. What else would somebody else think that adults say to kids to get them to finish high school?
To better themselves, be more successful.
To better themselves, be more successful, get a better job. I'll tell you what it is. It's one word, freedom. If a kid is already in trouble, not doing well, there are a lot of kids in school that do have the idea of bettering themselves. Don't misunderstand me, but we're not working with those. They're doing okay on their own. But those that we're working with are almost always the kids that there's one thing that stands out in their mind over everything else is freedom. The freedom to make their own decisions about themselves. So I used to ask kids, I said, I don't know what to do for you if I don't know what is this world that you see out there? And I used to say to a lot of them, would you let me crawl into your skin and see the world that you see? See, most adults think they know what kids are looking at when they see out there. And I discovered in court, in sitting through many, many trials in court, I found out that very few adults understand what a kid sees when he looks through his eyes out there. very few. And we gave them the most gosh-awful reasons for why they should do what they do. I'll never forget the father who brought his son in to me. This was not a court situation. He just brought him in to me. He was a junior in high school, and he told me, this is the way he introduced the subject. He says, "No son of mine is going to flunk social studies." And I knew enough about the case to say, well, he just did. Yeah, he says, "What am I going to do about that?" I says, "Well, you're not going to do anything about it." His son was right there, and I'm going to call him Dwight. I don't think that was his name. I don't remember what his name was. I'll call him Dwight. I said, "Dwight, what's the worst grade you've ever gotten?" He said, "Well, F." I said, "How did it feel?" He says, "Terrible." I said, "What's the best grade you ever got?" He says, "A." I said, "When's the last time you got it?" Well, it turns out that this last quarter, the very same quarter he got an F in social studies, he got 2 A's. I said, "How does an A feel?" He says, "Feels wonderful." And I said, if you wanted to make a better grade in social studies, would you know what to do? He said, "Yeah." I said, "What?" He said, "Study harder." I says, "Dwight, everybody says study harder." I said, "Does anybody know what study harder means? I mean, if you're going to study harder, what are you going to do?" I said, "You're going to stick your nose deeper in the book?" And then with a big grin on his face, he says, "Well, I could read it." See, we get these answers. Kids know that most adults will buy it if they say study harder. Yeah, study harder. But nobody says, what does that mean? What does study harder mean? Do you want to study harder? I've had so many kids who say study harder, they don't have to study at all. All they'd have to do is listen in class and they could make better grades. They wouldn't have to study harder. So it's this taking this time to find out and redefining who we are, redefining who the kid is, redefining who we are. If I could get parents, and especially foster parents, I'll never forget the set of foster parents that I worked with a few years ago. They're 2 children. They weren't foster kids. They were adopted children. And then I found out that they adopted them after they were both over 10 years old when they adopted them. And things didn't go well. And one of the things I discovered is these 2 people were condemning themselves every day for their failure without realizing what an enormous task they took on with these kids at that age. And they were blaming themselves. You know, in my work with juvenile delinquents, I figured that if I could be one adult in this kid's life who he may not show any evidence of having done anything that I thought he should do, but if there was one adult who he felt could understand him, maybe down the road, 10, 12, 15 years, he might say, you know, there was a guy in my life who took the time to really honestly make me feel that he understood me. In fact, I had a lawyer and his wife who, this happened just very recently. When their oldest child was junior high age, she just put them through the mill in every possible way. And now they're very proud of her. She's making all kinds of progress. She has a family of her own, and she's a very decent kind of a person. And we met very serendipitously just recently, and so they said, we got talking, they said, you remember when you was talking to our daughter? And I said, oh yeah. I said, I sure do. I remember that very well. And by the way, I felt like I didn't get very far with it. I really didn't feel successful with there. And they said, well, you were. They said, we were just talking to you the other day. Of all the people that talked to you and tried to help you, did any of them make any sense? And they said, no, none of them. Well, wait a minute, there was one. And then she referred to me. And you know what I did? All I did was, I don't think I gave her one bit of information or suggestion or anything that was helpful. I just tried my best to see the world that she saw. and how she was reacting to it. And I don't think I think what was transferred is an honest attempt to understand, not a successful counseling session. You see what I'm trying to say? And I'd like to switch gears now and talk about some techniques in communication. If we understand that if we start out with this redefinition of both who we are, do you folks understand that you are, at the core of your being, have you ever been in love? I'm going to tell you something about you that you probably didn't know. Both you and the person you were, did you get married?
20 years.
20 years. Now I'm going to tell you something. I found this out over and over again. Two people that love each other, if you start looking at what they love about each other, it is always these qualities that I just set forth. Love and joy and peace and patience. Nobody falls in love with dishonesty, or nobody falls in love with disrespect or friendless. We don't fall in love with those things. We fall in love with these qualities that can be described as our perfect selves. See now, what keeps you loving each other when the other person acts like a nut? What do? What keeps you going when the other person doesn't know how perfect they are? Because I suppose there's times when he's an absolute nut, right? Just if you don't believe that, ask her, right? So what keeps you loving when that happens? It is my contention that because down deep, even though we've never put it into words, we know that those qualities are still there even when we're acting like. We know that person, and the same way with your kids. There's times when your kids are absolute snots, but you keep loving them. Why? Because you're looking past the behavior to what you know is the truth here. But what I'm suggesting here is how you define kids, how you define yourself is how we behave towards each other. By the way, as I've watched marriages break up, it's so interesting to me. I don't think we fall in love. I think we wade in. And I think we wade out. Now, if you want to know what I mean by that, I've sponsored the dances down at the community building for 10 years. I was down there every Friday night for 10 years, excepting I got a few nights off during the summertime. But I was down there every night for what we called wigwam and teepee. Those are dances where we had them every Friday night. Up in Fort Collins, it was I forgot the name they had. They had them everywhere, and I just want you to feel sorry for me because I was down there every Friday night for 10 years. And in the first dance in the fall, when the seventh graders went into junior high at that time, I'd watch them come into the dance, and we'll start out with a girl, and she doesn't know whether she's going to be a wallflower all night or whether she doesn't know. Of course, now they can go ask the boys, but then they still had to wait for the boys to ask them, and they'd sit there, and here's this girl. She just really wants to be part of it, but she's afraid maybe she won't. She comes in and sits down, and then this little blonde-headed guy comes up and asks her to dance. And she's just absolutely delighted. And not only does he do that, he asks her over and over again. In fact, she dances almost every dance that night with this little blonde-headed boy. And now the only thing he really did that she really knows anything about is he asked her to dance. But she starts adding to that. You know, he's such a good-looking blonde, and he's so smart, and he's such a good dancer, and he's so thoughtful, and she adds all these attributes. And she goes home that night, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, she's in love. 2 weeks later, she comes back to the dance thinking she's going to have the same experience. And she goes in and sits down, and here this kid is already there dancing with another girl, and he doesn't ask her once that evening to dance. And you know, before that evening, after the dance is over with, she goes home and she says, he thinks he's such a cute little blonde. He thinks he's so smart. He thinks he's such a good dancer. And by 2 o'clock Saturday morning, she's out of love, right? The difference between her and us is it takes us longer. But when we look at each other and we shift from looking at the perfect self that's there and start looking at all the mistakes. When's this kid going to learn something? And we start focusing on all the things that are wrong. We're changing our definition of who the other person is. And our behavior towards them changes. I got to tell you this. We used to, when I first was appointed chief of probation, when we wanted special projects, in fact, this is the way Youth Service Bureau started. We went to the county commissioners and asked for funds to help start the Youth Service Bureau. And people on my staff would go in there and they just thought the county commissioners were interested in roads and bridges. That's all they were interested in. And that's why it was so hard to get money from them. And so one time, one of the commissioners, I went in after they had their meeting, and one of the commissioners says, "Paul, doesn't your staff trust us?" And I had to admit they didn't, because they thought they were only interested in roads and bridges. And I told my staff, I said, you know what? Those commissioners could do exactly what you wanted them to do, but because you think they're only interested in roads and bridges, you're going to put, what are they up to now? What are they trying to pull now? They're trying to make it look like they're really interested when all they're doing is interested in roads and bridges. You know what we do? We even take the good things that each other do and start interpreting them as manipulations. So it's very important that we pay attention to, how do I define this? How do I define it? Well, if I define the tools of my trade as weapons, if I define them that way, my behavior changes. We think it's our job to change our behavior, and I think before we're going to change behavior, we have to change our definitions of who we are, particularly ourselves. And I think it's perfectly okay for us to say to our spouses and to our kids, you know I'm perfect, but I just didn't understand what perfection was in this case, and so I blew it. I got to tell you this story. When my youngest son got his driver's license, he was driving my car, and one time he came in at 10 o'clock. We expected him a couple hours earlier. And he came in at 10 o'clock, and he came through the front door instead of through the garage door. So I knew there was something going on. So he comes walking in, and he was pacing around, and I was waiting, and he wanted me to say something, but I just waited. And pretty soon he says, Dad, you know when you turn off the highway there, you know how that gravel is right there when you turn off the highway? And I said, yeah. He said, well, I came around that corner too fast and slid on that gravel, and he waited a little bit and smashed into the curb. This time I said, how hard? He said, well, I blew out a tire. Now I'm going to do what I like to do with a lot of audiences. What would a good dad do at this point? That's what everybody says. And I say, well, I didn't see any blood. And he wasn't holding his arm or anything like this. So she says it may not be physical. Okay. So at any rate, I said to him, well, where's the car now? And he said, by the way, when I ask kids this, I ask them, and they'll say the same thing. Well, you should ask him if he's hurt. I said, well, he isn't. So what would a good dad do? They said, well, you should tell him not to turn the corner so fast. And I said, what did I do? Raise a dumb kid? He just came down the road, slipped on the gravel, smashed into the curb, blew out a tire, and he doesn't know that he turned the corner too fast? Oh, yeah. He said, well, tell him not to do it next time. I said, what did I do? Raise a dumb kid? He just came down the road, turned and slipped on the gravel, smashed into and he doesn't know that next time you don't do that? I said, what are we doing? So finally I keep doing this until somebody says, well, what did you do? And I said, well, as far as talking to him, I didn't do anything. I just said to him, I says, where's the car now? And he says, it's still up there. And I said, well, let's see if we can get it. So we brought it in. Now what was a good dad going to do? Yep, we did that, and he did a lot more damage than what he thought. He didn't just blow out a tire. He bent the rim clear back, and the tire was okay, but the whole front end was messed up. It cost me $250 to fix it up. Now, what would a good dad do?
Lecture time, maybe.
Do what?
Lecture?
Lecture. By the way, I found out a lecture to a kid can only be one word. His name is Mark, and I found out one time, I said to him, this is the next wreck. I said, Mark. That's all I said. As far as Mark is concerned, that was a lecture. By the way, what I did, he lost his good grade discount on his insurance. He, when the bills came in, insurance paid, I had $50 deductible, and I said, Mark, do you think it would be fair if you paid the $50 that I had to pay, and that you paid, I'd told my kids I would pay for their insurance as long as they kept a good grade discount. The reason I did that is I didn't owe them a car, but they were both out for sports, and I didn't want to have to run to school all the time and pick them up. I said, well, I'll furnish you with a car. I'll provide the gas and the insurance. But I said, I'm not doing this because I owe you a car. I'm doing it because I don't want to have to meet your schedule over there. This is for my convenience, not yours. So I told him, I said, do you think it'd be fair if you paid the difference on your insurance that we had to pay now because he had lost his good grade discount and the $50 deductible? And he says, oh, Dad, he says, that's more than fair. So here's something that he did that was really a mistake. It didn't show his perfection, did it? But did we deepen our relationship, or was it threatened? It very much deepened by that, because he felt like he was being treated fair. Now, people ask me, when you tell your stories, do you just tell do you succeed all the time? And I said, no, I just tell my successes. I don't ever discuss my failures. You have to understand that a lot of these are strictly Paul Holdemans. I call them Holdemanisms because you don't find it in the literature, and I may be all wrong. So, but I'll share them with you. These are some. Any of you psych majors? Okay, I'm going to give you a psychological principle that'll explain more behavior than you can possibly get from reading a book on psychology. It's simply this: everybody, absolutely everybody, seeks significance in their environment. And this is true whether they're mentally retarded or whether they're 6th graders or 10th graders or grandparents. It doesn't make any difference. Everybody seeks significance. I can start a fight anytime I want to simply by diminishing somebody's self-esteem. If I say to my wife, well, that's a dumb idea, I've got a fight on my hands, right? It doesn't make any difference. If I say to her, I don't think I understand what you're saying, would you try that again? How would that work?
Probably better.
See, it works a lot better if I own my own misunderstanding. Now, under this, this really is the way I say how to make an asset out of your ignorance. In other words, there's an awful lot you don't know about kids, right? I mean, whether they're your own or they're foster kids, you only see them a certain part of the time. So there's stuff going on that you don't know anything about all the time. So that's where our ignorance lies. It's in what we don't know. Now, supposing I could convince everybody who has foster kids that is an asset, what you don't know. Well, I'm going to take a stab at it. The first thing is everybody seeks significance in their environment. Now, under this is my umbrella term. In other words, under this comes these 5 concepts on how to communicate with kids, or with adults, or with businessmen. Doesn't make any difference. I guess they're mostly adults, aren't they? The first rule is be curious rather than interested in each other. The reason I say it that way is because I can be very interested in something, but also be very, very judgmental. For example, when when my son turned the corner and he came in the door, if I'd have met him at the door with, "Where in the heck have you been?" would I have been interested? Sure, I'd have been interested, but everything about it says, I really don't want to know I want him to know what is on my mind. So curiosity, by definition, says, I wonder how this looks to you. I'd like to see it from your perspective. Now, when people do something that's completely out of line for as far as our expectations are concerned, and we're curious to see what was going on, I say if you're curious, by definition, it's not judgmental. You don't know what it is, but you want to understand, and by asking questions, and I tell kids this. I come right out and say it. I said, I'd like to see this through your eyes. Would you let me into your skin and see how this looks to you? And, well, yeah, and usually, almost always, they appreciate it when you really want to know their point of view. I'll digress here for a minute. I had a mother and a 14-year-old daughter in one time, and every time the mother said something, the daughter would go like this. It didn't make any difference what mother said, her eyes would roll over like that. And then if the daughter said something, the mother would make fun, like she says, well, I asked her, where were you when that happened? She says, well, my daughter was in there cleaning her room. And this went on for some time, back and forth, and finally I said to the daughter, I said, do you want to communicate better with your mother? Do you want to really get along better with your mother? She said, yes. I said, then quit rolling your eyes up in your head. I said, do you realize what that does every time she does that? And then I said to the mother, and you realize what happens every time you say cleaning her room? I said, those are all put-downs. I said, how do you hope to... You're diminishing each other's significance, and you're not being curious. You're being judgmental about it. But if you're curious, you'd say, would you let me into your world and let me see what you want to see? Two very nice things happen as a result of that. The first one is this. When you ask somebody and you really want to know what they think and how they feel, you cannot do that without imparting worth to that person. It just does it automatically. By the way, if you want to, I can give you a brief outline. I made one for each of you, so that helps. When I really want to know what you're thinking, I can't do that without imparting worth to you. I'm treating you as though you're worth listening to. Does that make sense? See, this is why I talk about the marbles, because this business of communicating worth to each other is just so simple. I want to know how you feel. I want to know how you think. And by doing it, but there's another thing that happens. When you really ask kids to explain to them, do you realize that we seldom, when we're just thinking to ourselves, we very seldom finish sentences? So when I ask you to explain your position on something, you have to complete the sentence. And it becomes clearer to you. When you ask kids to explain why they did something, many times in the explanation they get the point. You don't have to say anything. So this was, you get clarity this way simply by being curious, and that's what I mean by taking advantage of your ignorance. You're just trying to learn something. That's all you're trying to do. You don't have to have all these techniques that say this is the time to bow, and this is the time to scrape, and this is the time to do this. And just be curious. And it answers so many different issues. The second thing that I call this my CLERT theory, because you can remember this by the 5 first words. In fact, I don't like to use notes when I speak, and so when I first did this many years ago, I arranged my points in the order that I could pronounce a word. The word doesn't mean anything. It's just a way of pronouncing the word, and then in my mind, when I was ready to go on to the next point, I'd remember what it was this way, but it's an easy way to remember it. The next one is what we talked about a while ago, is know your limitations. There's one thing that we lose track of, and that is that we lose track of the fact that I can't make somebody else think the way I want them to think. And anytime, folks, anytime we try to make somebody else do something that we want them to do, we set ourselves up to fail, because I can't make other... You know, I was at the Bill Reed one time, and I was in the teacher's lounge. I could go into the teacher's lounge anytime I wanted to. And in the teacher's lounge, I saw this note on the board. All teachers having such and such a kid in, please meet in room 400 at 4 o'clock this afternoon. We're going to discuss his attitudes, his grades, and his attendance. The counselor who put up the note was sitting right there. So I looked at this note and I say, why are you going to discuss his attitudes? Well, she says, don't you think he has a bad attitude? I said, oh yeah, I think so. All of his teachers think so. The principals think so. I happen to know his parents think so. So are you going to get together this afternoon and change his attitudes? She says, well, I guess not. And she walked up to the board and scratched out attitudes. I said, you see, we think he has a bad attitude. He thinks we have a bad attitude. Isn't that true? So what are you going to do about it? Anytime, let me make another statement. I saw this happen so many times in juvenile court. People made threats about kids that they had no power to carry out. For instance, if I said to a kid, I'm going to see to it that you go to the institution, do I have the power to carry that out? No, I don't. I can just make a recommendation. That's all I can do. The court has to do that. I've heard policemen do that. I've heard parents do that. And it ends up making us look foolish when it's all over with. To make threats. Now, there's two sides to that. One of them is you may have the power to carry out the threat, but you don't have the will to. For instance, if you say, if you do that one more time, I'm going to do this. You may have the power to do what you're saying, but you may not want to when the time comes. Always, another thing I'd suggest you do is never ask a question for which you already have the answer. In other words, if I say to you, where were you last night around 9 o'clock? And I already know where you are. What will she do if I ask a question like that?
You can either lie or say, you already know.
Or sidestep it in some way, exactly. So if I say to him, I was told that you were at that party at such and such a street last night, what's your side of the story? I tell what I know, and you're 10 times more likely to get the truth than if you say, where were you? And you set a trap and they don't know which way to go on that one. So this is another thing about limitations. Police set traps like that, and for interrogation it might be very appropriate. But between us and kids, I don't think it's hardly ever appropriate to set traps like that. Okay, the third one is learn the art of doing the unexpected. You know, we all learn to play games. And playing games is a very difficult thing to handle because we all do it and we get very good at it. And kids are especially good at it. You know, I told you a while ago that I spoke to these 12 classes for 13 years on how to get along better with your parents. One of the things that I learned from those kids is that if I asked them, they'd tell me what their plans were, and I'd say to them, well, boy, I said, how are you going to get by your parents on that? And they'd say, bug them long enough and they'll give in. They knew what it took to break their parents down. I know one kid, his dad had committed suicide, and all he had to do is to get mom in shape is threaten suicide. And she'd do anything he chose to. And there's all kinds of things like that. So when you learn the art of doing you know what I do when kids tell me how horrible their conditions are? I know there's experts who wouldn't agree with me on that, but I'll say, a lot of times I'll say to them, have you ever thought of suicide? And you know what I usually get? They'll say, yeah, I thought of that, but I don't want to do that. I said, are we through with that subject? They'll say, yeah, and we're through. Then if they're not, if they expand on it a little bit, I find out where they are, but I've opened up the subject in a way, and I'll come to this a little bit later, because it has to do with how you do it, and you're not judgmental about it. They'll tell you their secrets. I'm absolutely amazed at what people will tell you if you're not passing judgment on them in the process. They'll tell you some of the deepest secrets if you are non-judgmental about it. But learning the art of the unexpected is much more simple a lot of times when it says, when they've done something and I said, you know, I really missed it. I really blew it with you on that one. I said, I was upset at you and I said things. And they're so surprised to have Dad and Mom tell the truth about their own mistakes. In fact, I would tell you that probably one of the most angry responses I've ever gotten from a kid went like this. He says, my dad is never wrong. And if you want to surprise a kid, tell you, you know, I was really off base on that. In fact, involves Mark again, my son Mark. When he was about a third or fourth grader, he was the kind of a kid that would put his head right in front of the TV, you know, just about that far away from the TV. Have you ever seen that? And this was on a Saturday morning, and I said, Mark, I said, do you want to move over and let the rest of us see? Well, now, Mark always obeyed, but he'd obey to the extreme. So he'd go clear over at the wall and push up against his, is that all right? You know. And this particular morning, it just sparked my anger, and I just grabbed him. And I didn't like to punish the kids in front of each other and diminish their esteem, you know, their dignity. But I didn't do a very good job of that either. But I jerked him into the bedroom, and I didn't spank him or hit him, but I just pushed him down on the bed till he kind of bounced, you know. Well, I used to cut their hair on Saturday afternoon, so I was cutting his hair. I told him, I said, Mark, I said, don't you ever do that again. You know, I really cut him to shreds, right? You know. But on this occasion, I pushed him down on the bed, and I felt lousy. I knew I'd done a poor job of parenting. And so that afternoon, I was cutting his hair, and I said, Mark, I said, this morning when I got upset at you, do you think it'd be possible to recognize that you had it coming, but forgive me for the way I did it? And Mark said, oh, that's okay, Dad. And then I felt like crying, because I found out that when we face our own stuff that simply, you quite often get in some of the most adult responses from kids. Not always, but sometimes. And we're looking for percentages, I think, as much as anything else here. Okay, the fourth one is this. Learn a new definition for respect. I've had so many adults say to either their kids or whoever they're in charge of, he says, I demand respect. And I say, you don't demand any respect whatsoever. You demand behavior, but you don't demand respect. So I like to say it this way. Respect to me means that I treat what you say as just as important to you as anything I say is to me, even when I don't understand it. So when I don't understand what you're saying, I assume that you've got something important. And by the way, that's even true when they're lying or when they are joking about something you said. You treat it with respect. And you find out, you know, I don't think I'm getting this. Would you try that again, or would you help me to understand what you're getting at? I don't think I quite understand. And there's been times when Helen and I have actually come to the place where we'd say, well, I simply do not get what you're getting at, and I'm going to have to bow out and process this and come back to you on it, or something like that. because there are times when we simply are not on the same page. But we can handle that. We can say, I know I'm not understanding. You own your own misunderstanding, and say, let's get back in 30 minutes or an hour or tomorrow morning or whatever it is. The last one is probably, this one is probably as important as any of the others, and that's tone of voice. I'm convinced that 90% of the fights we have in our homes and in schoolrooms comes from tone of voice, not from issues. We spark the anger, and then we look for issues to support the fight that's already underway. And I had to learn the hard way how I sparked that. In fact, one time, Helen and I had been married maybe a couple years. By the way, we've been married 52 now. But we'd been married a couple years, and one day she said, Paul, do you know how you sound over the phone? I said, well, no, not particularly. She said, you sound gruff and angry. "30 years later, she said to me, Paul, how can you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and answer the phone and act like you're sitting wide awake waiting for it to ring? And the only way I have to answer that is I practiced. How do I sound? Do I sound? I had someone the other day tell me I was in a rage. I said, well, I was just passionate. She says, what you call passion, I call rage. Now, that didn't make her right. But at least it makes you stop and think, what's the tone of voice? Because adults, have you ever watched adults? They'll be talking to you in the most normal tone of voice, and a little kid comes in, and suddenly they go into this jargon. Oh, you cute little thing. I mean, their whole voice, everything changes, and they're talking to this kid in a whole different patronizing tone of voice. I went to the doctor the other day. I had to get some tests done. And I'll swear the nurse that talked to me, you'd think I was this old man who had gotten childish and said, now step right over here this way. And, I said, just talk to me in a normal tone of voice. I'll hear it and I'll respond accordingly. So we can have that patronizing tone that we talk to each other. And I think kids appreciate it when we treat them like adults. And by the way, let me tell you something. When 12-year-old kids come into my office, I say, in this office, you're an adult. I said, how does that sound? They don't all like it. Most of them do. They'll say, that sounds good. I said, you know what that means? They said, no. I said, that means you can think as well as I can. The difference is that I have more experiences to draw from than you do. But you can think as well as I do. See, I can talk to a kid on any subject there is as long as I use his vocabulary or expand his vocabulary to include what we want to talk about. Let me give you one quick example. When our oldest daughter was not quite 4, she said to me, she and I were at home alone, and she said, Daddy, why does it get dark? I said, well, Bonnie, okay, I'm going to try and explain this to you, and I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. And I turned out all the lights in the room excepting one table light, and I took the shade off, and I had a tennis ball there, and I rotated that tennis ball around this table light, and I showed her how the shadow stayed. Then I kept turning it as I was going around like this to show her how the earth turned. And I said, now, Bonnie, do you think you understand? And I said, if you don't, you're just going to have to wait till you get older, because I don't know how else to do it. And she says, I understand, Daddy, I understand. Well, I didn't know whether she did or not. But in June, that would have been in first part of April, last part of March. In June, she was in a Sunday school class, and the teacher was going to teach the kids, and God made it dark so we could sleep, And so she started asking the kids, you know why it gets dark? And Bonnie said she knew. And she explained this. The teacher told me afterwards in detail how the shadow goes around like that, blew her completely out of the water. She didn't know what to do with her lesson then, because it was going to be this simple thing, well, God makes it dark so we can sleep. And but it's amazing. I've been, through the years, I've been amazed at how much kids can understand, and we don't give them credit for it. And that's what diminishes them. So another thing I've seen kids get very angry about is when their parents have to explain something every time they ask them to do something because they're too dumb to figure it out, you know. And we can always ask them, do you remember the last time we talked about it? Do you think you still know that? You can ask them those questions, but to tell them as though they don't know is very diminishing, and it shows up in our tone of voice so often. I'd like to say that I have a profound respect for the fact that we do it incrementally, little by little, as we explore these things, and our kids understand it when we say to them, in fact, I said when kids complain about their parents, especially if it's an oldest child, I'd say to them, this is the first time you've ever been 16, isn't it? Well, yeah. And I'd say, well, how many 16-year-olds have your parents raised before? Well, I'm the first one. I said, well, would you be willing to allow them as many mistakes as what you want them to allow you at age 16? And most of the time kids will say, well, yeah. One kid said, I said, would you allow your parents as many mistakes, since this is their first time through, as what you want them to allow you? And he said, half. And I thought that was fair enough. Kids can't establish their identity saying yes to mom and dad all the time. You can't establish your identity always saying yes. That's why kids go through two particular times where they according to Erickson, one of them is around 2, we call it the terrible twos, because they're saying no. And just along this line, I remember the story of the little 2-year-old playing out in the yard, and his mother caught on how to handle it. So he'd be playing out in the yard, and she'd come to the door and said, your daddy and I are going to eat dinner, and you can stay out here and play if you want to. And then she goes back to the table, and the little kid says, no, and comes in, you know. It's it's playing with these things. See, we want our kids to be obedient until they turn 18, and then we want to have a mind of their own. It doesn't work that way. In fact, I remember something. I just loved it when my kids, I could talk about their resistance. May I take the time to tell a story? This is Mark again. Where we used to live, there was an open stairway with just an iron railing, and right there was a couch and a TV, and he came up the steps one day and just exploded on the scene. He says, see there, Dad? He says, I'm the only one around here to obey the rules. And I looked around to see what rule was being broken, and before I could figure it out, he said, Pris has got her shoes on the couch. And I looked over and I said, yeah. I said, Pris, I said, he's right. I said, you want to get your shoes off the couch? And she did. And I said, Mark, you seem too angry for the occasion. Is there something else bothering you? And this big guy had just finished a wonderful year as middle linebacker on the Loveland football team. He tore off down the steps and burst into tears. And he says, yeah, and I don't know what it is. And so Pris and I were very concerned, and we went back to watching TV. And pretty soon Mark came back up the steps, and he says, Dad, he says, I think I figured out what's bothering me. I said, what's that? He says, my sex life isn't complete. Well, you know, my generation didn't know it was supposed to be complete by age 16, and I'm sure that, see, I'd learned before that problems almost never surface at their source. So I said to him, I put together a conversation we'd had around the table 3 nights before. We were sitting around the table, and Mark says, I'm going to a party tonight. And we trusted him because that's another story, but he had done some things that made us really trust that he could go to a party even where things were going on that we didn't approve of. And And he had proven that he could handle himself in that situation. So Helen and I were very trusting of him. And then he added, he says, I'm going to take Jim's girl. And I suppose Helen and I must have, Jim was his best friend. And we must have looked at each other something like this. And he saw us, and he said, yeah, he said, Jim, trust me, he can't go, and his girlfriend wants to go, so he asked me if I'd take her. Well, I don't know if I'd want to be trusted under those circumstances, you know. But apparently, we let it go. And so the next night, or that next, when he said his sex life wasn't complete, I put this together, and I said, oh, Mark, this is where curiosity plays a big role. I said, Mark, do you mean that it bothers you that all your friends have steady dates and you just date different girls? I hit the hot button the first time through. You don't very often do that. But what Mark didn't know is that he let me be smart by what he said before. He let me in on it, you see. I had to put it together, but he's the one who made me look smart. And so when he said, and it was the hot thing, and I said to him, well, Mark, I said, I can't help you on this one. He said, why not? I said, well, because I like it the way you're doing it. I said, you know, when I was in high school, I had what you might call tunnel vision. I said, there was only one pretty girl at a time in my class. Now, there was a series of them, but only one at a time. And I said, I'd get so gung-ho about this that I couldn't see the whole picture. I wish I'd have done it the way you did. So I said, I can't help you. He's disappeared down the steps, and pretty soon he came back up and put his arms on that iron railing, and he said, Dad, you don't think that helps, but it does. And that little simple story tells so much. The curiosity allowed me to see a bigger picture, and knowing that problems almost never come up at their source. You know that between your husbands and wives. You find out afterwards you're not fighting. The fight wasn't about what the real issue was. It was your struggle to deal with it. And so you have to get back. Helen and I made up our minds that we would not let those fights go, but wait till we cooled off and then find out what we really were fighting about. It's almost never the same as what you thought it was. And same way with kids. So with that, I think it's time to wrap this up. Thank you very much for your kind attention.